My grandfather left me his estate and $2,500,000. The parents who cut me off at 16 showed up at the will reading saying, "We'll manage it for you." But when the executor opened the folder, they turned pale. I, 32 sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Henderson and Associates, staring at the polished table while my hands stayed perfectly still in my lap. The leather chair felt too soft, too expensive for someone like me. Across the room, my parents shifted in their seats, their designer clothes and practiced smiles making them look like they belonged in a place like this. I hadn't seen them in 16 years. Not since the day my father told me to pack my things and never come back. The executor, a silver-haired man named Robert Henderson, shuffled papers at the head of the table. My grandfather's death 3 weeks ago had been sudden. A heart attack in his study. His housekeeper found him slumped over his desk with a pen still in his hand. I'd gotten a call from Henderson's office the next morning, informing me of both the death and the fact that I was named in the will. The funeral had been small. I'd stood at the back, watching my parents greet distant relatives and business associates with practiced ease, never once looking in my direction. Now they sat 15 feet away, and my mother kept glancing at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Something between pity and calculation. Henderson cleared his throat and began reading the preliminary items. Small bequests to staff members, donations to charities. My parents listened with barely concealed impatience, my father checking his watch twice in as many minutes. They'd arrived 20 minutes late, apologizing profusely to Henderson while completely ignoring my presence. When my mother finally acknowledged me, she'd smiled and suggested we all have dinner after this was finished, as if 16 years of silence could be bridged over appetizers. Then Henderson reached the main provisions of the will. My grandfather left me everything. The estate in Connecticut worth approximately $4 million. The various investment accounts and properties totaling another $2.5 million. His collection of rare books. His vintage car collection. Everything. The room went silent except for the sound of my father's breathing, which had suddenly become audible. My mother recovered first. She laughed, this bright artificial sound that echoed off the wood paneling. She said how wonderful this was, how Grandpa had always loved me so much, how proud he would be. Then she leaned forward, her smile widening, and suggested that since I was probably overwhelmed by all this, they should help manage everything. My father nodded eagerly, adding that they had experience with estates and investments, that they'd make sure nothing was squandered. I said nothing. Just watch them. Henderson's expression remained neutral as he reached for a thick manila folder that had been sitting separate from the other documents. He explained that my grandfather had left specific instructions regarding the distribution of the estate, and that these instructions included certain documentation he felt was relevant. My father asked what kind of documentation, his voice carrying an edge now. Henderson opened the folder and began removing contents, laying them out on the table with careful precision. The first item was a timeline, printed in my grandfather's precise handwriting. It detailed every time my parents had asked him for money over the past 16 years. Every loan, every investment opportunity, every emergency that required immediate cash. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, none of it ever repaid. My mother's face went white. The second item was a series of bank statements. My grandfather had apparently hired a private investigator 8 years ago, shortly after my parents had asked him to invest in my father's business venture. The statements showed where that money had actually gone. Luxury vacations, a boat, renovations on their house, high-end cars. None of it had gone to any business. Henderson continued laying out documents. Emails between my parents discussing how to extract more money from my grandfather. Text messages about hiding purchases from him. A particularly damning series of communications about how they needed to keep me away from him because I might interfere with their access to his wealth. That last part made my stomach turn. I'd always wondered why they'd worked so hard to keep me from contacting him after they kicked me out. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He demanded to know where my grandfather had gotten these documents, whether they were even legal to obtain. His face had turned a deep red, the color spreading down his neck. Henderson calmly explained that my grandfather had been thorough and that everything in the folder was documented and verified. Then he picked up another sheet of paper, this one an official-looking legal document. He read it aloud. My grandfather had included a provision that if my parents contested the will or attempted to claim any portion of the estate, a second folder would be released to the district attorney's office. That folder contained evidence of financial fraud, tax evasion, and elder financial abuse that my grandfather had been documenting for years. The room went completely silent. My mother started crying. These theatrical sobs that I remembered from my childhood whenever she wanted my father to give in on something. She turned to me, reaching across the space between us, saying she was sorry, that they'd made mistakes but they were still my parents. She said we could work through this as a family. I finally spoke. I told her we stopped being family when I was 16 and my father told me I was a disappointment and threw my bags on the front lawn because I didn't want to go to law school. When they changed the locks and told the neighbors I'd run away. When they refused to sign my financial aid forms, making it nearly impossible for me to get student loans. When they returned my letters unopened. My father tried a different approach. He said I was being manipulated by a dead man's bitterness, that my grandfather had never understood their financial pressures, that raising a child was expensive, and I should be grateful they'd kept me clothed and fed for 16 years. Henderson interrupted. He had one more document. This one was a letter, handwritten by my grandfather and dated 2 months before his death. Henderson asked if I wanted it read aloud or if I preferred to read it privately. I told him to read it. The letter was addressed to me. My grandfather wrote that he'd known for years what my parents were really like, but he'd hoped they might change. When I was 16 and suddenly stopped visiting, he'd hired the investigator and discovered what they'd done. He'd wanted to reach out immediately, but his lawyer advised him that as an adult, I had to want contact with him. He'd been waiting for me to come to him, not realizing my parents had told me he wanted nothing to do with me. He'd only found out the truth 2 years ago when he'd run into my former roommate from college at a charity event. The roommate mentioned how hard I'd worked putting myself through school, how I'd juggled 3 jobs and still made Dean's List. How I'd told him my grandfather had disowned me along with my parents. My grandfather wrote that he'd spent the last 2 years trying to decide how to handle the situation. He'd wanted to contact me, but wasn't sure I'd believe him over the story my parents had told. He'd decided to wait until after his death, when the truth couldn't be disputed. He apologized for not being braver, for not reaching out sooner. He said he was proud of what I'd accomplished on my own, and that he hoped this inheritance would make my life easier, not as a replacement for the relationship we'd lost, but as a tool to build whatever future I wanted. The letter ended with a single line. He loved me, and he was sorry. I sat there staring at the table, processing the fact that for 14 years I could have known my grandfather, could have had him in my life, if my parents hadn't lied to both of us. My mother was talking again, her voice high and desperate. She insisted the past was the past, and we needed to focus on moving forward. She suggested we sell the estate and split everything 3 ways, start fresh. I looked at her directly for the first time since entering the room. I told her no. My father exploded. He said I was being vindictive and cruel, that they were drowning in debt, that the business had failed and they'd lost everything. He said I owed them for raising me, that children had responsibilities to their parents. Henderson mentioned the second folder again, the one prepared for the district attorney. He suggested my parents consider very carefully what they said next. My father's mouth snapped shut. I stood up. I thanked Henderson for his time and asked him to proceed with the estate transfer according to my grandfather's wishes. I told my parents I didn't want contact with them going forward, and that if they attempted to reach out, I would instruct Henderson to release that second folder. My mother asked how I could be so heartless. I told her I'd learned from the best and walked out. Update 1. That was 6 weeks ago. Henderson finalized the estate transfer last week. The process was smoother than expected, mostly because my parents didn't contest anything. I heard through Henderson that they'd consulted 3 different lawyers, all of whom apparently advised them that fighting the will would be financial and legal suicide. The estate in Connecticut is massive. 15 rooms, original architecture from the 1920s, gardens that my grandfather had maintained meticulously. I walked through it 2 weeks ago, seeing all the places I'd played as a child before everything fell apart. My old room was exactly as I'd left it 16 years ago. The model airplanes I'd built with my grandfather still hung from the ceiling. My bookshelf still held the collection of adventure novels he'd bought me every birthday. In his study, I found something that broke me completely. A box, tucked in the back of his closet, filled with letters. Letters addressed to me, never sent. 16 years worth of them, chronicling his life, asking about mine, telling me about the garden and the books he was reading and how much he missed our weekends together. Each one ended the same way, with love and hope that someday we'd reconnect. He'd written me every month for 16 years and never sent a single letter because he thought I'd rejected him. I sat in that study for 3 hours, reading every single one. The money has been transferred to accounts Henderson set up for me. $2.5 million. I keep looking at the numbers, and they don't feel real. I've spent the last 16 years working 60-hour weeks, living in a studio apartment, driving a car I bought for $1,500 that breaks down monthly. I'd built a decent career in graphic design, enough to live on, but nothing extravagant. Now I have more money than I can properly conceptualize. Henderson asked what I wanted to do with the estate, whether I'd sell it or keep it. I'm keeping it. I'm going to restore it exactly the way my grandfather maintained it. I'm going to finish reading every book in his library. I'm going to learn about the rare editions he collected and why they mattered to him. I'm going to tend the garden using the notes he left in his greenhouse. I got an email from my mother last week, sent through a new address I didn't recognize. She said my father was in the hospital with stress-related chest pains. She said they might lose their house. She said I had the power to help them, and choosing not to made me no better than they were. I deleted it without responding. Henderson asked if I wanted him to send a cease and desist letter. I told him to wait. If she contacts me again, then yes. But one email isn't worth the energy. My grandfather's housekeeper still maintains the estate. Her name is Margaret, and she's worked there for 30 years. She found me in the study that day, surrounded by unread letters, and she sat down and told me stories about my grandfather's last years. How he'd kept my room maintained, hoping I'd visit. How he'd refused to let my parents stay at the estate after he'd discovered what they'd done. How he'd talked about me constantly, proudly telling anyone who'd listened that his grandson had put himself through college and built a career from nothing. She said he'd been happiest in those last 2 years after finding out the truth, knowing that I hadn't rejected him after all, that I'd been as much a victim as he was. I asked her to stay on. She's been managing the estate, helping me understand my grandfather's routines and preferences. She's teaching me about the garden, showing me which roses were his favorites and why he'd arranged the greenhouse the way he had. I'm slowly beginning to understand what I've inherited. Not just money and property, but a legacy. A life my grandfather built and maintained and wanted to share with me. Update 2. 3 months since the will reading. I've moved into the estate permanently. Gave up my studio apartment, sold what little furniture I had, packed 16 years of minimalist living into a dozen boxes. The move took half a day. Margaret helped me unpack, showed me where everything should go, told me more stories about my grandfather. The estate feels different now that I'm living here. Less like a museum and more like a home. I've been working remotely, setting up an office in one of the spare bedrooms. The internet required upgrading, but everything else is surprisingly modern. My grandfather had maintained the property meticulously. I found his journals 3 weeks ago. Decades of them, leather-bound and carefully organized in his study. I've been reading them chronologically, learning about a man I thought I knew, but really didn't. He wrote about his business career, his marriage to my grandmother who died before I was born, his relationship with my father. That last part is painful to read. My grandfather had known for years that my father was irresponsible with money, that he made poor decisions and blamed others when things fell apart. He tried to teach him, guide him, but my father had always wanted shortcuts. Quick money, easy success. When my father married my mother, my grandfather had hoped she'd be a stabilizing influence. Instead, she'd enabled his worst tendencies. The journals detail years of watching them live beyond their means, make terrible financial decisions, and then come asking for bailouts. My grandfather had considered cutting them off multiple times, but never did because of me. He'd been afraid that if he stopped helping them financially, I'd suffer. So he'd kept writing checks, kept covering their mistakes, all while watching his son become someone he didn't recognize. The journal entries from 16 years ago, right around when I was kicked out, are devastating. He wrote about how my father had called him, ranting about me being ungrateful and difficult, refusing to follow the path they'd planned. My grandfather had tried to mediate, suggesting they give me space to figure out what I wanted. My father had accused him of undermining their authority. 2 weeks later, my grandfather had shown up at my parents' house to check on me. They told him I'd run away, that I'd stolen money and left in the middle of the night. They'd acted devastated, worried. My grandfather had believed them initially, had even filed a missing person report. When the police found no evidence of me anywhere, my parents suggested I'd probably left the state, that I'd always been rebellious. My grandfather had hired the investigator then, but by the time he'd learned the truth about what really happened, I was already a legal adult, and he'd been advised that contacting me might constitute harassment if I'd chosen to cut ties with the whole family. His lawyer had told him to wait, to give me space, to let me reach out if I wanted. He'd waited 16 years. I've started therapy. Henderson recommended someone who specializes in family trauma and complex grief. I go twice a week, trying to process everything. The therapist says what I'm experiencing is a unique form of loss, grieving someone I've already lost, while simultaneously discovering I never really lost them at all. My parents tried a different approach last month. My aunt, my father's sister, called me out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken since I was a kid. She said my father was devastated, that the stress was killing him, that surely I could find it in my heart to forgive. She suggested a family meeting, neutral ground, just to talk. I asked her if she knew what they'd done to me at 16. She went quiet. Then she admitted my father had mentioned we'd had a falling out over my college choices. I told her it wasn't a falling out. I told her they'd kicked me out, cut me off, told my grandfather I'd run away, and spent 16 years letting both of us believe we'd rejected each other. I told her about the evidence my grandfather had collected, about the fraud and manipulation. She hung up. 2 days later, I got a vicious email from my mother's account, though I suspect my father wrote it. It called me ungrateful, vindictive, and cruel. It said I'd destroyed their lives, and they hoped I'd suffer the way they were suffering. It threatened legal action, though for what exactly wasn't clear. Henderson sent the cease and desist letter the next morning. He included a reminder about the second folder and what would happen if my parents continued contact. I haven't heard from them since. Margaret says I'm starting to look like my grandfather. Something about the way I move through the house, the way I've taken to reading and his study in the evenings. She says it would have made him happy, seeing me here. I've been going through his financial records, trying to understand how he built his wealth. He was brilliant with investments, patient and strategic. Henderson has been teaching me the basics, helping me understand what I've inherited and how to manage it. I'm not naturally inclined toward finance, but I'm learning. It feels important, like honoring his legacy. The rare book collection is extraordinary. First editions, signed copies, books I've only ever read about. My grandfather had detailed notes about each one, why he'd acquired it, what it meant to him. I've started reading them, working my way through his collection the way he'd intended. The garden is thriving. Margaret and I have been maintaining it together, following my grandfather's careful cultivation plans. There's something meditative about it, working with the soil, watching things grow. I understand now why he spent so much time out there. I've made a decision about the money. Most of it is going into careful investments, following my grandfather's strategies. But I'm setting aside a significant amount for a foundation. Something focused on helping young people who've been kicked out by their families, who are trying to put themselves through college without support. Scholarships, emergency housing assistance, mentorship programs. My grandfather couldn't help me when I needed it because he didn't know. Maybe I can help others who are going through what I went through. Henderson says it's a good plan. He's helping me set up the legal structure, connecting me with people who run similar foundations. We're calling it the Second Chance Foundation. My grandfather would have approved. Update 3. 6 months now. The estate feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has. I've established routines, patterns of living that echo my grandfather's, but are distinctly mine. Early mornings in the garden, afternoons working in my office, evenings in the study with the rare books or the journals. The Second Chance Foundation is officially established. We awarded our first round of scholarships last month. 15 kids who'd been kicked out or cut off by their families, who were working multiple jobs while trying to stay in school. The look on their faces when we told them they'd been selected, that they'd have full tuition coverage plus living expenses, I'll never forget it. One of them, a kid who reminded me painfully of myself at 19, asked why I was doing this. I told him someone should have done it for me, and since they didn't, I was doing it for him instead. Margaret says my grandfather would be proud. I hope she's right. My parents made one final attempt at contact 3 weeks ago. They showed up at the estate unannounced, getting past the gate by claiming to be expected guests. Margaret found them trying to get into the house through the back door and called the police before alerting me. I came down from my office to find them being escorted off the property by 2 officers. My mother was crying. My father was shouting about family obligations and inheritance rights. The officers weren't impressed. Henderson filed for a restraining order the next day. It was granted within 48 hours. My parents are now legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me or the property. I thought I'd feel something when I saw them. Anger, maybe. Sadness. Instead, I felt nothing. They were strangers. Whatever connection I'd once felt, whatever lingering hurt or hope, was gone. My therapist says that's progress. That indifference is sometimes healthier than anger. I've been dating someone. We met at a foundation event, someone who volunteers with a similar organization in the city. She knows my story, knows about my grandfather and my parents and all of it. She doesn't treat me like I'm broken or need fixing. We go slowly, carefully. It's nice. The estate hosts events now. Foundation fundraisers, community garden days, book club meetings in my grandfather's library. Margaret was nervous about it initially, worried about maintaining the property's dignity. But I think my grandfather would have liked seeing the house filled with life again, with people who appreciated what he'd built. I found the last letter yesterday. It was separate from the others, in a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened when you're ready." Henderson had included it in the original folder, but suggested I wait. I opened it 6 months to the day after the will reading. My grandfather wrote it the week before he died. He said he'd been feeling his age lately, that he knew his time was limited. He said if I was reading this, it meant his plan had worked, that I'd learned the truth and reclaimed what should have been mine all along. He apologized again for not being braver, for not reaching out directly. But he said he'd watched me from a distance over the years, through the investigators' reports and occasional glimpses at events where he could see me without being seen. He said he'd watched me build a life from nothing, accomplish things that many people with every advantage couldn't manage. He said he'd been proud of me every single day. The letter ended with instructions. He wanted me to live whatever life made me happy, not the life my parents had wanted for me, not the life he might have imagined, but the life I chose for myself. He said the money and property were tools, nothing more. What mattered was what I built with them. He signed it the same way he'd signed all the unsent letters, with love and with hope. I'm sitting in his study now, surrounded by his books and his journals and the life he built. The garden outside is in full bloom. The foundation is helping kids who need it. The house is filled with purpose again. I think I'm finally ready to stop being angry, to stop dwelling on what was stolen from us. My grandfather spent his last years documenting the truth and planning a future for me. The best way to honor that isn't to punish my parents. They're doing that to themselves perfectly well. The best way to honor it is to live. So that's what I'm doing. Living in this beautiful house, building something meaningful with the foundation, growing the garden, reading the books, falling in love carefully and honestly. Building a life my grandfather would be proud of. Building a life I'm proud of. My parents made their choices 16 years ago. My grandfather made his choices in response. And now I get to make mine. I choose to move forward. I choose to help others avoid what I went through. I choose to honor the man who never stopped loving me, even when he thought I'd stopped loving him. The past doesn't change, but the future is mine to write, and I'm writing a good one.